Wait, there's no way I'm the most highly educated person on this podcast. That's wild.
Have you got a master's?
No, I dropped out halfway through.
Yeah,
I did half a master's.
There you are. Yeah, you are. You are.
Hello, I'm Todd, your host, and this is the Life of the Party podcast, a deep dive into everything Green Party, your party, left-wing parties in the UK, trying to work out which party we should all be a part of. I am with my wonderful friends and comrades, Shanice, McBean.
Hello, hello.
And Jonas, Marvin.
Man forgot my name. Like, what's going on?
No, I forgot.
What?
I forgot as to whether I was meant to say your name before you said hello. All right, so
say my name.
important information for listeners.
Hey, we're keeping this as well.
Yeah. This is staying. Look, important information for listeners. For Shanice and Jonas, it's currently 8 p.m. For me, it's currently 7 a.m. because I'm at a conference in Australia. So I am going to be all over the place for this podcast for sure. I really thought I'd get through the first minute though. That's disappointing. I thought I'd get through the first minute. Anyway, look, we've made it. We're here from different sides of the world, 15,000 kilometers away. We managed to commune around our love and deep interest of trying to work out the Green Party and your party and other parties in the UK. Just a couple of announcements before we properly get going. One of our first speaking dates has been announced. Norwich Transformed We Can Reveal is gonna be the first Life of the Party live event ever. It will be the only first Life of the Party live event, clearly and obviously, and it will be on the Saturday, May the 16th. It's in Norwich. It's from 9:30 until 5:30. It'll be an amazing day. There'll be loads of great stuff going on. I think we're doing 2 sessions, and then Jonas is cheating on us and doing a third on food and the politics of food with James Meadway. So Jonas is going to be knackered by the end of it. 3 sessions in a day. But yeah, come to that. If you go on eventbrite.com and search Norwich Transformed 2026, you can get your tickets there. It'd be really, really cool to meet a bunch of you. But yeah, without any further ado, Jonas, I think you're doing the news this week.
Yeah, that's right. Joe's in Australia. Shanice is in London. Jonas is going to France for this episode. I really wanted to cover the recent French municipal elections because I think there's a bit of a lesson to be learned from the experience of the radical left party there, the France Insoumise, who I will now refer to as LFI, so I don't have to butcher the French language any more than necessary.
Say it again. Say it again.
And I want to, at least I remember the names, bro. And I want to say a shout out just to my friend Cy and Paul for talking with me about these. They have a much deeper understanding of France than I ever will. LFI is a radical left party led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, ex-socialist party, which is equivalent to our Labour Party in France, ex-Socialist Party minister and politician. On the left of the party, Mélenchon has now run several times in the French presidential elections, usually coming fourth until the 2022 presidential elections when he came a close third, getting almost 8 million votes, but failing to make the second round of the presidential elections. I think for all elections in France, maybe someone else could correct me on this, but I'm pretty sure. So for presidential, for municipal, and for legislative elections, France runs a round system. So if you don't get a majority in the first round, then it goes to a second round runoff phase, excluding all but those who make the threshold, essentially. In the 2024 legislative elections, LFI and Mélenchon were the leading component of what was called the New Popular Front. So it was an alliance with them, the Socialist Party, the Greens, some smaller anti-capitalist parties. This came first in the first round, second in the second round, losing out to the fascist National Rally Party. And this is kind of part and parcel of the dynamic for an organization like LFI, trying to break the logjam, which always sees the political center, often over the last decade in the form of Emmanuel Macron, face off against the far right in the final round of the election. Now, in the recent municipal elections, LFI were forced into a political gamble. They ran alone rather than as on a list in lots of places and performed, I think you could say, moderately well, particularly given they'd never really put much effort into municipal elections in the past. They won two municipalities, Saint-Denis, which is around the Parisian suburbs, where Bali Bagayoko won in the first round on a ticket of rent and utility caps, health insurance, twinning with Palestinian cities and refugee camps, reclaiming public services, and I think really interestingly, and something which he's received a lot of racist attacks for, disarming the local police force. In Roubaix, a post-industrial city in northern France, David Iroud was elected on a similar platform. As well as this, LFI returned hundreds of councillors across the country, particularly in the bigger cities. Mélenchon has argued since last weekend that while the fascist national rally, the party formerly of, or not formally, the party of Marine Le Pen is gaining massive ground and well ahead of the radical left, yet La France Insoumise is progressing faster with an 8.5 points increase in the recent election. So in medium-sized municipalities, LFI performed well. In municipalities with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants, LFI candidates qualified for the second round or exceeded 10% in 118 municipalities, and in 91 municipalities with fewer than 30,000 inhabitants. As some election analysis has also reported, LFI's campaign against abstention significantly increased participation and its voter share in places where it performed well, particularly in Roubaix and Saint-Denis as like standout examples. Now, I know what our listeners must be thinking so far. All right, mate. The French left did well in some local elections. What's the news in that? After all, you could argue that this election shows both that the Socialist Party significantly outperformed LFI, which it did, and you could argue that the problem is still fascism, and the French left would have done a lot better at taking advantage of the collapse of French centrism, Macronism, if it had run joint lists under the new Popular Front. And I think this is the interesting thing here. This is the challenge of this story. Just a couple of months ago, a fascist was killed in a clash with anti-fascists in Lyon. And ever since then, since that moment, that has been a spark for the far right, the Macronists, and the media to conduct a very brutal war against LFI, blaming them for the murder, linking the killing to an elected LFI rep. LFI have incredibly impressively, in my opinion, confronted this McCarthyite right-wing campaign, one which from the outside feels even bigger than the kind of 2018, 2019 anti-Semitism crisis over here, by basically holding their position, defending the rep who has been linked to the death, although the link is incredibly thin, it should be said, and making clear that anti-fascism is a red line for them. They weren't responsible for it, but they also won't budge against an alliance between the centre and the far right. For example, it should be noted that Macron had LFI listed as an extreme left organization, and Mélenchon went onto one. He kind of attacked it as absurd, but then he also defended the extreme left and talked about his Trotskyist youth, which was quite amusing. But crucially, this right-wing panic has split the New Popular Front. That was a big, this New Popular Front, a big symbol of unity to the left in 2024, has kind of broken down, with particularly the Socialist Party absolutely going for LFI and using it as a stick to beat them with, saying they won't stand in alliance with them nationally, although that's been complicated locally, where Socialist Party branches, just like Green Party branches, have entered into lists with LFI against the kind of diktats of their central offices. For the Socialist Party, there's a clear angling for a break because they think they're best placed to succeed Macron, who is crashing out, and they have experienced some revival over the past couple of years. But despite all of the daily attacks, LFI have recruited 5,000 new members. That's before the local election results. They've outperformed quite well in the elections themselves, making themselves central to 20 municipal coalitions. And local Socialist Party and Greens have been forced to diverge from their list, from their leaderships, and align with LFI in certain instances. And so despite the Socialist Party obviously outperforming LFI, there is this kind of sense, particularly in the banlieues, those multiracial working class suburbs of the French cities, that LFI are steadily and slowly, I put a lot of stress on those two words, usurping the PS. And I guess for me, the importance of this news story is in this. I find it really inspiring that a party that has refused to call Hamas a terrorist organization, which openly heralds what they call creolization, against laïcité, this kind of particular brand of French Islamophobic secularism, and they embraced kind of everyday multiculturalism. A party that calls, in Mélenchon's words, for the nationalization of time, which stands against racialized state violence, such as the police murder of Nahel Mazouk 2023, and develops candidates out of the movements and turns them into leadership. Kader has done all this and held this line in this way. I find incredibly impressive. There's a big question about how the electoral system benefits in them being able to do this that we could probably talk about more. But they have increased voter share in some industrial seats too. And the Kader they're producing, increasingly migrant, working class, from the banlieues and the cités, like the new mayor of Saint-Denis, are incredibly impressive. And I think for me, with the electoral system in mind still, I just think it's a good example of where the politics of left coalitionism can hit their limits sometimes in the parliamentary sphere. And, I would say LFI kind of best represent in the French political sphere, if you like, our politics, the three of us. We can disagree about that if that's not true, but I think that is true. And, I think they're best able to stand on job in the face of such a humongous assault. The best defense is offense. And the genuinely radical left should not feel obliged to bow its head when it's under attack from those on the right of its coalitions, even if it risks the coalition itself.
Yeah, look, Jonas, I think that was completely right and super comprehensive. I mean, I thought it was very interesting to see that the right have brought back and raised this idea of a cordon sanitaire, which is, usually the language with which the centre and the left talks about creating a firewall between them and the right, and making sure that the far right in particular don't gain too much ascendancy within an electoral system. They brought up that idea to cordon sanitaire the left, and specifically LFI, and say like, well, nobody should be working with LFI because they're a group that are beyond respectable politics and they bring too much violence into French politics, and they should be essentially outlawed. And there was this real kind of like lawfare move to outlaw them. And it was, it was not funny, but a little bit funny insofar as, the PS, the Parti Socialiste, engaged in this too. It wasn't just the centre and the right. Like the PS have fallen in heavily criticising LFI because they see the possibility to get an advantage over LFI, as you said, Jonas. But this came back to kick them in the arse in a bunch of races, because they did merge lists with the LFI in a bunch of races in Lyon. That's the reason why the Green candidate won, Gregory Duchette. And in Marseille, they didn't merge a list, but the LFI stepped back to make sure that the right wouldn't win there. Is it like Nantes or like Nantes? I can't do any French pronunciation.
Nantes.
N-A-N.
I think I always say like Nantes. Yeah.
Non.
So
okay,
not quite Nantes, but like non.
Yeah, no. I was just like, it can't be Nantes. Is it Nantes? Can't be Nantes. But like in Nantes, the socialist candidate won because they merged their list with the LFI. So actually, like this did happen, not even just at like a local level, but at a city level in loads of different places. But there were some places that, at least in some people's analysis, the socialists ended up losing because they merged the list with the LFI. It was a more quote unquote moderate electorate, or it wasn't quite like the places that the LFI won, and then that hurt them. So it's funny that like the socialists, in trying to gain an advantage over their former like NPF comrades and partner party, are kind of damaging their own chances in some places because they're kind of confronted with the electoral reality that they have to work with LFI to get over the line and beat the right. But then it's harder to work with LFI because they've just spent loads of time criticising them and saying that they shouldn't even be in politics, which is kind of an obvious blowback if you think about it in those terms. But obviously they didn't think about it in those terms. I think the other thing to know is that, these local elections are significant because there's a presidential election next year. So that's, that's the kind of like run up, is the presidential elections next year. And I think it is worth understanding LFI's strategy of not compromising on these things and going hard on a lot of positions that, are massively accord with our politics in light of the French electoral system and in light of what they're trying to achieve, which is to win the presidency. And it should be said that is LFI's like, like number one North Star aim. Like this was the first time they engaged in these local elections in a serious way. Really what they care about is the presidency and get Mélenchon into the presidency in particular. And it's a 2-round voting system, but it's also one which doesn't have constituencies and is proportional insofar as you don't need to win people all across the country. You can just concentrate your vote in specific areas. And this is totally the LFI strategy is to basically concentrate their vote in working class, multiracial areas or suburbs of cities and more working class cities. And as you say, Jonas, it could well be working, and it'll be really interesting to see how that expresses itself in a national vote rather than a local vote. But I think that strategy is, for me, is kind of like downstream of their electoral system, because their electoral system kind of allows it, if that makes sense.
I guess I have more of a question than a reflection. And my question is, there's this sense that the French do it differently. They just do it differently than the British. They get their trucks out and they leave manure and shit everywhere, and they mash up their town centres, and they're brawling with the cops, and they just like do it differently in France. And I think although sometimes this is romanticisation of French struggle, there is also a reality that, since the early 2000s, there's been a skepticism of neoliberalism within French society that just is not mirrored in British society and in the British working class. And, I guess this is shown in the fact that even radical Trotskyist groups have done much better in France electorally than they ever do in places like Britain or England or Scotland or Wales. And so, given that there is this kind of broader context of skepticism to neoliberalism, how do we learn the lessons for us in Britain? Because our response to right-wing insurgency is left-wing resistance. It's a defensive position. We're resisting, we're trying to kind of shore up our position against the insurgency of the right. Whereas you could make the case that in France, they're in a more privileged position because it's right-wing insurgency versus possibly sometimes a left-wing insurgency. So rather than it being resistance and a defensive position, it's polarization, it's more offensive. So it's a different context. So, I really admire the things that you described, being able to hold the line, have red lines, hold a position. That's exactly, the sort of thing that I argue for here. I guess in our context, it feels much more idealistic, whereas in the French context, it feels much more kind of rooted in their kind of historical context and feels more material. So how do we learn those lessons given it is a very different context?
And just as a kind of like a short rejoinder to that, because I do really agree with that analysis of like French society, but I suppose, I mean, politically, what was happening in 2016, 2017 in France was the launch of En Marche, which became Renaissance in 2022. So Macron's kind of like centrist, almost like populist centrist, like restoration party, right? Which is not who have held lots of power. Well, he's been the president since. So that's the thing that we haven't had in the UK, and I suppose it's notable that at the same time that was going on in France, Corbyn had just won the leadership of the Labour Party, and he was pushing in that same period, was pushing the Labour Party to the left. So I think it's this funny countervailing thing of, yes, French society just seems a lot more radical and pissed off than British society, but then the kind of the expressions of that in the party form have been quite different to ours, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to underplay to what extent the electoral systems themselves are a feature here, and what kind of benefits that gives for the French left that don't necessarily exist in a parliamentary sense in Britain. Although I do wonder sometimes, if the left was serious in this country, despite all of the constraints of local government, that there might be some openings in that sense in terms of running councillors in the same kind of political mode as LFI. I guess there are two parts to that provocation, Shanice, which I think is a really important one. The first one is a kind of much more historic one, which is like, we had the English Revolution, we had the Civil War, but at the end of the day, we still ended up with a monarchy, right? We didn't chop the heads off our kings like the French did, right? And so there's kind of story about like the revolutionary legacy that permeates throughout French history that doesn't really quite permeate throughout British or English history. And I think there's absolutely something to that, right? In France, you had a mass communist party. In Britain, you had the Labour Party, right?
Yeah.
Like the kind of levels of incorporation that come with one that don't quite come with the other are important to note. So there's that part of it, which is important. I think sometimes overstated, but important. And it's worth saying, like, I'm reading Mélenchon's book at the minute, and he kind of explicitly, whilst he embraces this creolization stuff on the one hand, quite inspired by this guy Edouard Glissant. He also, on the other hand, is like, we have to struggle over the terrain of the national popular, right? And I think you and me would quibble over that, but which says we have to resuscitate and revive this radical history from below that has struggled in the French nation. And at least in my sense, whether you kind of buy a kind of national politics strategy that tries to reclaim nationalism, I think the left in this country have always struggled with that, regardless of whether you think that's a right strategy or not. And the second thing for me really is that neoliberalism was just considerably deeper in Britain than it was in France. Like some of the neoliberal reforms that we've already experienced, the French are fighting in the 2010s. You know, in 1995, you had this mass social movement, I think partly against pension and welfare reforms, but my history is sketchy. There was mass social movement organizations like Attack, big riots in the banlieues, like 10 years later. And also kind of the left, I think an important feature as well is the left did quite well at putting forward a left position on the European question, which the left has never done in Britain. So I think that question about the deepening of neoliberalism means a lot. Like like I was reading about, for example, in the north of France, fears of the Communist Party in the deindustrialized north being usurped by National Rally, by the party of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella. But in lots of constituencies, the Communist Party, Mirabeau, still held on. And you look at the stuff that the Communist Party does in these municipalities, you can go to the gym for free, you can go swimming for free, you can go and watch a film for free. There are these cultural questions and dynamics that exist in French society because neoliberalism wasn't as deep as it was in Britain that have a real bearing on political action and ways of seeing the world, I think. That being said, I'm not totally convinced that British Islamophobia was anywhere near as pernicious and mass as laïcité, for example. And I think the left in this country always had a harder line on that, correctly so, than the French left has. Really now, it's only now, today, that the French left the mainstream French left, radical left, is getting better on those questions.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that includes LFI, right? I mean, LFI didn't always have a good position in Islamophobia at all, and it came in a change of strategy when they started to court the vote of Muslim communities, that their position on this shifted. I'm not saying it shifted just because the strategy shifted, but it did really shift. And I think before then they were kind of, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think they were pro burqa bans, and they were against the hijab, but you know what I mean? Like they took some positions which would be very alien to the British left, for instance. I just also wanted to come back on the and almost contradict myself a little bit on the electoral system stuff, because I think how people are forced to vote has a real power to shape the possible politics of political parties specifically. And it's really funny seeing it in Australia. Like in Australia, they have mandatory voting. It's wild. You get fined if you don't vote. So 100% of people come and vote, and they have preferential voting. So you have to go to the ballot box and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and rank all of the parties. Even if you hate every single party, you have to rank every single party. It's absolutely wild system. But it means that parties in elections are not fighting over the 40% of most engaged and most polarized and most political people who actually bother to turn out to vote. They're fighting over 100% of people, including the vast majority of people who probably don't pay much attention to politics at all. Now, some people here argue that has moderating effects. Some people argue it doesn't. It's debated. But I think it does really, really shape the system. All of this said, everybody made the case that first past the post in the UK guaranteed a 2 to 2.5 party system, the Labour-Tory duopoly, and the conventional wisdom before the last election was that there was nothing that could be done about this. Independents would never win. The Greens would never replace the Labour Party, and first past the post would just be this straitjacket on our politics forevermore. We really don't need to tell listeners of this podcast what's happened over the last couple of years. It's you know what I mean. It's just clear that actually first past the post is not doing this anymore, and the frustration and anger that voters feel is starting to break the electoral system and overpower the electoral system. And I just say this to emphasize that although these systems constrain us, they they do not fully determine us at all, and very unexpected things can happen.
I guess I have another provocation. I don't know if you guys have read the book Rednecks and Barbarians, Uniting the White and Racialized Working Class by Huria. And I'm going to butcher this. Huria Butelja.
I think that's
apologize. Right. I apologize if that's wrong.
I said I think that's right, but I also don't want to act like I am the voice of the French on this podcast, because I ain't. As we might see in the comments.
I want to pose a provocation around race, and we talked a little bit about Islamophobia, but I want to talk about race as more a state construct, a capitalist construct, and I'd be really interested to hear from you, Jonas, how this has kind of played out in this election. But Butelja essentially argues that, and this is a very classical radical revolutionary argument, that one of the barriers to a new revolutionary movement in France is disunity, historical disunity between the buffs, the white proletarians, and the barbaras, the racialized proletarians. And there's this brilliant quote in the book, and she asks this really provocative question. She says, "Who are you to the rednecks? Who are you underneath your white coat?" And the idea behind this provocation is that, there has historically been this reification of whiteness in France, of exclusion of racialized minorities from the national project as a means to create a social contract that ties the French working class to the state and shores up the power of the capitalist state, and that there's been a long process of pauperization, as she describes it, of the white proletarian class in France. And so she asks, who are you underneath your white coat? Ultimately, you're just a proletarian. But what is really, I think, provocative, and I'm not sure if I agree, she argues that the resolution to this and what the left should be doing is arguing for a new popular sovereignty, that we need a new nationalism, a left nationalism, essentially. And she couches it in this in terms of like a decolonial Frexit. And then she also makes the case that the left need to construct an alternative white dignity. What does white dignity look like, and how do we describe and how do we construct that? So how is this deeper question of race as a social construct and this historical disunity between kind of white working class people in France and the racialized others and outsiders, how has that played out in the election?
If only there were a French commentator to give us more information. The attacks on LFI candidates have been insane. So, for example, they have a European parliamentary candidate called Rima Hassan, Palestinian, incredibly effective politician and communicator, and has just been absolutely vilified by the French press.
Using kind of classical racial tropes, I imagine. And
And also kind of, a kind of extension of those classical racist tropes, the kind of all of the talk about her being an anti-Semite, etc. that you can anticipate. And then Bali Bagayoko, who won in Saint-Denis, who I've spoken about, the kind of, particularly because of this question of disarming the local police force, has just been victim to an insurmountably horrendous amount of abuse and attacks from the center, from the right. For example, they've talked about him being a crackhead on the French press, and all of these kind of deep, sustained racist myths. So, I don't have a detailed enough answer to say like where are the unities being constructed between the racialized working class and the banlieues and the kind of broader white French working class, right? I can't give those answers. I can say that I saw Huria Butelja speak a couple of years ago, just after the book had been published. It's an interesting book. I think I had pretty profound disagreements with it. You've alluded to what some of those disagreements might be.
Same.
But and it was interesting because this was a good marker of where LFI have gone. Because, at the end of her talk, she talked about how much admiration and support she had for LFI and for Mélenchon because they were on this journey away from the kind of laïcité that had become the mainstay of the French left to a more radical position, a more meaningfully anti-racist position. And I think in her kind of book, there is a kind of expression of that lash up between this politics of creolization on the one hand, which is that we celebrate, it's almost like Stuart Hall in the noughties, that kind of fondness that he has for globalization and for multiculturalism, that he celebrates the fact that all of these people from all across the world now live in the same areas. You have the white wannabes who speak patois, he talks in those terms. There's a bit of that to it, but it's also adjusted against the fact that this happens in the nation form. And so there's this turn to talk about politics through the national form, which is the kind of political form of modernity. And as you kind of see the kind of disintegration of neoliberalism of whatever post-modernity exists today, right? Like where the nation is coming back in force in the most kind of revanchist ways. The truth is, I don't know. This is a much more sharper question for us here, where the electoral system, particularly the parliamentary system, struggles to afford you those political unities between places like where I live and places like where you live. It doesn't seem to me, maybe with the exception of some of the noise and the activism that was involved in the Yellow Vests movement, the Gilets Jaunes movement, which was about 8 years ago now, I think, the Yellow Vests against fuel price rises, I think. Apart from that, I don't see a lot from LFI about articulating those kind of, as you say, pauperized whites from the deindustrialized rural regions of the country with the kind of multiracial working class of the suburbs. I don't see enough of that. I don't see any of that really. But I'm also not the keenest observer of French politics. But I think that's the question, right? For all politics in global North countries today, that is one of the central questions that we confront.
Yeah, and I think, I'm thinking out loud now, but I guess there is something in what Batelja argues. I wouldn't necessarily frame it in terms of we need to construct a new white dignity. I don't know if I'd frame it in that way. But certainly I think there's something about we need to construct a new working class dignity. And I think, partly my kind of reticence with concepts like whiteness and left-wing patriotism and the nation, I think my uncomfortability with these concepts is that often, the nation is used to flatten class differences. The nation
100%.
is used as this way of saying, we need to ally together as British people or as French people, and completely erases and flattens class. And then you're able to kind of build alliances based on racialized inclusions and exclusions, and then we're fighting over who is and isn't British, as opposed to having a racial or a national war as opposed to a class war. So there's my discomfort with that, but I do agree that we need to reconstruct new dignities. That's the bit that I do agree with. And the thing that I come back to when I think of this, for me, I absolutely love British history. Absolutely love British history. Not the bit where they stole black people from the shores of Africa and enslaved them in, the cotton trade and made themselves rich. Not the bit where they then chucked those black people in the Caribbean and made money off of colonies and built its empire. The bit where the dockers in Liverpool went on strike to end the slave trade. That's the bit of British history that I love. The bit where working class women in the East End of London fought for working class men's and women's suffrage. That's the bit of British history that I love. The bit where black and brown communities and trade unionists and working class communities came together and fought the fascists in Cable Street. That's the bit of working class history that I love. And I think there is something in retelling those stories, and not retelling those stories, but also constructing new forms of class dignity off the back of them. Yeah, I think there's something in that, but it also feels like in French society there is, possibly because of the history of the French Revolution, there is this attachment to nationhood that just feels so embedded and intrinsic.
Yeah, I mean, and just to riff on that a bit more, like whenever you talk to a trade union organizer, you'll quickly realize that most trade union struggles are not about wages, they're about conditions. And why are they about conditions rather than wages? Because they're actually about dignity and dignity in yourself at work and pride in your work, rather than about like brutal economics. And actually people value respect more than they do the size of their pay packet. often. And I actually just think this is incredibly instructive when you're looking at say a Green Party politics that sometimes has shrunk to the idea of like a wealth tax or better wages or the kind of like the purely economic. And then you look at the more expansive form of that, which I think we've talked about with Zoran Mamdani, where like, yes, the demands are economic, but he tells this big, powerful story of dignity and respect and collectivity and togetherness that is universal in its sense of being for New Yorkers, but specific in its sense of being multiracial and recognizing all of these different communities and all these different experiences. And I think there's a lot to draw from and learn in our current moment when we're talking about constructing new dignities, I think.
Yeah, just a quick point, which is to say that it seems to me that there's a parallel there between what happened in France and Zoran Mamdani and his campaign, in the sense that there's the winning solution seems to be this combination of talking about kind of, bread and butter class issues, housing, economics, childcare, etc., and combining that with a story of connection to the people around you, and a story of class unity, of solidarity, and a story of identity. So I think the Raise the Colours campaign, where people went around the country putting British flags and English flags up everywhere, is a really good example of this. Obviously, there's a part of that campaign that was about racist intimidation. We've seen this throughout history before. I talk about this on my Substack. For example, Jim Crow, where people will use very visible, very public symbols to communicate who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group, who's included, who's excluded, who's part of our national and racial stories and who's not. And those flags are supposed to communicate to the out-group that we're here. And if you slip up at any point, you can be a victim of our violence. We're the dominant group, we're the majority, we're here, and we're not going anywhere. But why a national flag? Why a flag that tells a story of identity? And I don't think it's enough for people to say, oh, the right are rising in this way because people are poor. And if you just turn people into kind of monetary subjects and just talk about class, you'll win them over. For me, there's clearly something here going on around people staking out their place in the world. They're asking, who am I? What is this world? What is my place in it? What is my story? What is my connection to people, to place? Where is my sense and source of dignity and respect? And you can't fix that just by paying people more. It's much more, for me, it's much deeper, it's much more profound.
I mean, another example of this is the liberal frustration with the supposed economic irrationality of Brexit. It's just like people, you know what I mean? It's like, why have people voted to be poorer? It's like because people vote based on things that aren't just economics.
Exactly.
All the time.
I really think there's like one politician in this country who's like just brilliantly placed to communicate this and does it so well, and it's Muffin Ali. And the video that came out recently that he produced, where he's on a bus, someone told him to go back where he's from, so he jumps on the bus back to Sheffield, and then he talks about these kind of bonds of unity, complicated unity, fraught with these questions of race that he grew up with and that his parents lived through, but that represented something different. And I think this is one of the key unifying things here, right? Is that the video really, he has this poster that he shows of his dad where of a black and a white worker, I think, and these chains that bind them, and it talks about the breaking of the chains. It's very Leninist. But I think one of the brilliant things about the video is about loss, right? It's about the loss of a life world that doesn't exist anymore, and how people are struggling to deal with that, and how people are struggling to deal with new life worlds that have emerged that are incredibly oppressive and that are awful to deal with and that are incredibly costly, both financially and in terms of your psyche and your body and everything else. And I think that's one of the things about the left is in that question of dignity, there's also the question of what you've lost. And we don't talk about that loss enough, because in that loss, there's the kind of psychic loss, there's the financial loss, there's the spatial loss, there's all of these different losses, and we have to talk about that more, because that is the breeding ground for right-wing resentment and its proliferation in working class communities, I think, in lots of ways. And and we have to be better at politicizing that, which isn't to say that I then think we have to kind of adopt the nation form as the kind of the salvo of our politics. I don't. I'm a proletarian internationalist in that kind of classic Marxist sense, but I do think we need to get better at talking about a history of resistance to capital and empire in this country in a way that Mélenchon does, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important, particularly in a context where, because of these overlapping crises, I know some people have described it as polycrises, that politics has become zero sum. So it's not the case that, you know, for example, the migrants should be paid well and the white British workers should be paid well, because if the migrants paid well, it's zero sum. I'm losing something. So actually, I'd rather be paid less if it means the migrant doesn't get fuck all. And that's the kind of mentality of politics, right? People are willing to accept less if it means their enemies, or who they perceive to be their enemies, are defeated. And in that context, and I guess I've said this before, it's not just about kind of, you know, economic gains. It's literally about hearts and souls and minds.
Yeah, totally.
And that's a different struggle than just, well, you know, if you talk about class, you'll win people over. Nah, it's deeper than that.
For sure.
Cool. Okay, thanks so much for that, guys. Our longest news section ever, for sure. But maybe the richest. Maybe
I feel
the
like
richest.
I barely spoke.
Maybe the richest. Okay, so let's move on to this week's hot take. Shanice, what have you got for us?
So I'm going to be talking about NATO and Western imperialism. But I do want to preface this by saying I am not a NATO expert, and I am not an expert on Western imperialism. I feel I know much more about kind of our domestic context, and that's a weakness of mine. But let's treat this as a pub conversation, and we're hashing things out as comrades. So give me a little bit of grace.
I mean, it's worth saying that Shanice is doing this NATO take because I tried to do this twice in previous episodes and failed. Like, I would try and prepare for it, and I'd be like, fuck, what am I going to do? And I would back out of it at the last minute every time. So, like, yeah, much love, Shanice.
You're welcome, Joe. You're welcome. So let me just start by painting a bit of a picture of, first of all, well, what is NATO? So NATO was founded in 1949, and that year is really important. We're talking about the post-Second World War context, and we're talking about a context where the US, the United States, came out of that war as a global power and wanted to cement itself as the globally dominant Western force. But crucially, not through the now, at this point, we're talking 1949, failed traditional colonial approaches to global dominance, the approaches of Europe, but instead through a different mechanism, through free markets, and free markets that were built entirely around US trade, US industry, and US political hegemony. So this is the context that kind of NATO arises in. Not only this, but there was a competing vision of what a dominant version of capitalism should look like. And that competing vision came from Russia, the kind of state-controlled version of what a capitalist economy should be. So NATO was both about solidifying US power by developing strong military presence in Europe, but also structurally tying Europe and the key kind of economies of Europe into both an economic and military allyship and relationship to the US. And that's a relationship that ended up becoming subservient, and that's important. So the US wanted to do this both, again, we're talking 1949, both to keep Germany from re-emerging as a significant force and as a bulwark against the competing vision of capitalist power that Russia represented. So Britain comes into the picture. Obviously, Britain joins NATO, and kind of Europe gets behind NATO. And the context for Britain is empire was crumbling, national liberation movements were severing ties with the metropole. And I know there is controversy around how we pronounce the word. Is it metropole or metropole? But I stand by metropole. I stand by metropole as the pronunciation.
We'll let you have that, mate.
We've got the national liberation movement severing its ties from the British Empire. And so Britain and Europe had an interest with allying, an economic interest, a military interest with allying with the new big boy in the room that was the US. And so this relationship develops by NATO helping to fund counter-revolutions in crumbling empires, so supporting France in Indochina, for example. And it helped shore up European military power. But the cost of this, particularly in the case of Britain, was subservience, was being a junior partner to what was becoming the dominant global power that was the US. So from the very beginning, NATO has always been about protecting and defending US dominance in the world, militarily, economically, and also shoring up what was left of Europe's empires. So NATO is bad. Ideologically, how does it function? Well, it kind of shrouds itself in this kind of veneer of Western Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideals. So democracy, progress, rules, order. But what we also know about the actual Enlightenment period is that behind all of these new liberal ideas was a reality of violence, was a reality of barbarism, and the invention and reproduction of racisms to ideologically buttress slavery. And in the case of NATO and its proliferation of, Enlightenment ideals, there's no difference here. So NATO kind of follows suit. So against its own projection of it being a rational, democratic, civilizing force, it contrasts itself to the totalitarianism of Russia, the barbarism of China, the terrorism of Iran. So it requires and it functions, its ideological ballast are these racial narratives and racisms that play a core function both in justifying its belligerent power across the world, but also kind of shoring up consent to war and imperialism in its domestic populations. Again, we know NATO is bad. We know NATO is not actually about democracy because in 1949, it admitted Portugal to NATO, but to the alliance when Portugal was at the time a dictatorship. And we also know that one of the kind of core mechanisms of NATO's domination is using violence and barbarism to undercut democratic processes and install sympathetic puppet leaders. So we know that the kind of veneer, the ideological veneer that NATO presents itself as is bullshit. NATO is bad. Zara Sultana is right. NATO is bad. So... But there is a but here. There is a but. So to kind of really highlight what that but is, let's fast forward to today. So what we're seeing today with the US launching unilaterally a war in Iran, we're seeing the same script, the same bullish script playing out where the US launches an illegal and amoral imperialist war. It expects Europe to fall in line. But I think what is different about NATO today, what is different about the context of US imperialism today, is there are structural and possibly permanent fractures that now exist within NATO between the US and between Europe. And there are also fractures in US society within MAGA that I think make this context ripe for the mainstreaming of anti-NATO positions and a socialist vision of world peace. So just to kind of hash out some of these kind of structural fractures a little bit more, MAGA is completely split on Iran. The America First crew are saying this war is completely not in US interests. They're also arguing there's a second layer to the argument, which is that Israel dragged the US into this war because Israel now controls the US or controls US interests. And we have to be careful on the left with this argument because it risks veering into quite an unhelpful anti-Semitism, the idea that the tail wags the dog, i.e. Israel controls America, which is two steps away from saying the Jews control the world. But it is true that Donald Trump as an individual, as a human, barely, but as a human, it is true that he is so temperamental, so emotional, so bent on looking macho, looking cool. See what he did in Venezuela, abducting the president of Venezuela. He's so intent on modeling himself as a great American badass that it actually isn't inconceivable that him launching the war against Iran was actually the result, or at least partly the result, of heavy Israeli lobbying and schmoozing and selling him this idea of an irresistible story of grandeur. And I mean, they called the thing Operation Epic Fury, which sounds like, I don't know if people play Call of Duty. It sounds like a teenage boy's clan tag. It's like just so ridiculous. So there's that personal element to it. And this is important to the fracturing of NATO, because Trump makes NATO an incredibly unreliable ally, and by extension makes the US now an incredibly unreliable ally because of his personality. But there is also the structural dynamic here, which is the decline of the US empire, and the fact that, at least as far as I understand, the US can't stop China economically or industrially, and actually therefore can't stop China politically. And so in order to shore itself up as a global power in this kind of potentially new world, it's pulling away from two things. It's pulling away, number one, from the idea of the globe, and it's shoring itself up regionally or hemispherically. So, Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland, this push for hemispheric power, but also now this pulling away from its European allies as it tries to dominate the West. So that's one kind of, I think, structural element. But the other is this decline of hegemony is leading to a turn to just straight bullish, brutish, spectacular, theatrical violence over politics, because the kind of political sphere is being foreclosed. It's almost kind of, with Pete Hegseth, for example, it's like military pornography. It's like these cartoon generals puffing out their chests in the most ridiculous way. And it's just really buffoonery form of power. And as part of that, there's kind of a complete abandonment of any pretense of rule, of international order, although that never really existed for the global South. It's now just being completely abandoned. And the idea of alliances as well is being completely abandoned, because to Trump, the only thing that wins is power. It's zero sum. There are winners and losers. There's no in between. And the US will win global dominance by pure force alone. And I guess maybe this was partly the logic behind the tariffs as well. You can just kind of bully your competitors into, and so even your allies, into submission. So the question now is kind of, all right, well, what does this mean for the left? So the Trump administration is configuring and reconfiguring US power in this context, and it's reckoning with its emerging position in the global sphere, possibly in, and I know, Jonas, you've got a lot of truck for this idea, possibly in a multipolar world where there's kind of multiple dominant forces. And in this context, it's finding itself fracturing its old power bases. Europe, internationally with Europe, and domestically with MAGA. And so now what we're in is a period of huge flux, of huge change. Domestically within MAGA, the war in Iran is the most unpopular war going into the war in US history. MAGA figures are publicly breaking from Trump. Key people that boosted his campaign are breaking from him. And there's evidence that there was a power struggle between J.D. Vance, who's positioning himself as America first and, anti-war, and Trump. So huge fractures within the Trump administration. This war is possibly the worst thing they could have done after the Epstein files to fracture MAGA, and they've done both. Add on top of that, it's not clear this war is winnable. Iran geographically is situated, its military is situated in lots of mountains and underground. Its military network is diffuse. It's more of a network. It's not a hierarchy. And ideologically, whereas economic and death and troop deaths are painful for the US, ideologically for the administration in Iran, pain is neither here nor there. You know, this is a holy war. Pain is martyrdom. So it's very possible that the US won't win this war, and coming out of it will be either embarrassed or humbled. And in this context, Europe is scrambling to reckon with, you know, the US as a now very unreliable ally. So, the left. What does this mean? My answer is actually, I don't know, but.
Well, that's very spicy.
But what I do know is that in contexts of change comes possibility. And that possibility and kind of looking for alternatives and trying to construct socialist alternatives doesn't happen automatically. But it happens as a result of us fighting openly for a socialist vision of world peace. It requires us to, you know, work to change facts on the ground, to build up our side's balance of power. So it's not always the kind of working class that is at the sharp end of the global working class that's at the sharp end of imperialism. And so on the one hand, we have Zahra al-Sultana's kind of maximalism, which is leave NATO now, NATO's bad, but no story of kind of why or how we do that or where we go to when we do that. So although I do agree with Zahra al-Sultana that NATO is bad and we should leave it, there's a huge gap in the story that she's telling. But then on the other hand, there's kind of Zach Polanski, who quite frankly is really indecisive on this question. I think he recognizes that this is a moment for new ideas, and I think he recognizes this is the time to break from the status quo on NATO. So, for example, earlier in the year, he said that we should boot the US from British military bases, which is an interesting idea and definitely goes against the grain. But Zach Polanski's also caught between the orthodoxies of the Green Party on the one hand and the possibilities of the moment on the other hand. So, you know, sometimes he says that we should change NATO from within. Sometimes he says it's unreformable. Sometimes he says we should eventually leave sometime in the future. Sometimes he says we need to go back to the old idea of the European Union. So my argument is I don't have answers, but I can offer you a polemic, which is that we need leaders. We need leaders that are both unapologetic in arguing for a world without war, who are unafraid to go against the status quo on war, on NATO, on militarism, on imperialism, who emphasize and center the capacity for working class militancy and global working class solidarity to undermine and blunt militarism and imperialism, and leaders who tell powerful stories about world peace that don't rely on discredited institutions of capitalist domination like the European Union, and don't gloss over Western imperialism with fictions of a reformed NATO. And ultimately, we need leaders who understand the necessity of internationalism and struggles abroad to making socialism at home. So I'll leave you with that polemic. I'll leave you with that.
Jeez.
What do you think, comrades?
Fire. It's packing so much fire there.
I mean, not as much fire as the US is in Iran, but
yeah. Well, you know, it is kind of, yeah. I mean, sometimes you feel like I feel like this a lot, particularly over the last couple of years. It's just like mad, like how much we actually are living through history.
Yeah,
and not in like some facile way, but like in like incredibly monumentally era-defining historical events. And you know, 7 times out of 10. That's awful, basically, in this current world. Feels horrible. But like, there are times, for example, when the Iranians turn around and they say, well, you call it Operation Epic Fury, we call it Operation Epic Failure. We're like, oh, this is fantastic. There's so much there, Shanice. I mean, it's worth saying. I mean, I love your refusal to call the Soviet Union communist. I think our tanky comrades are really going to love that. But I guess a few things for me, like obviously with the war in Iran, like it's worth saying, like the scales of success, like the metrics for success, are so fundamentally and radically different for the Iranian state compared to the Americans, right? So when like Trump is talking about, oh, we've blown up everything, like they are defeated, all this sort of stuff. It's like people are aware of how flat that is and how much that falls on deaf ears, because the Strait of Hormuz is closed down right now and blocked. Yep. And like that has a fundamental, I think James Meadway has talked a lot about deglobalization. If you want a demonstrative example of deglobalization, shut down the Strait of Hormuz, where oil and gas and fertilizer and all sorts of stuff absolutely central to the reproduction of human beings across the world is there. For example, like fertilizers like sulfur, for example, huge amounts of it grown and produced in the Middle East and then imported to other parts of the world, has to be imported to other parts of the world at a particular time of the year. So like harvests can be cropped and all of this sort of stuff. That's going to have a dramatic impact on domestic food systems in the global north, especially food systems in the global south. It's going to have a massive impact on import-dependent food systems like in Britain, who have really weak food systems. And people are going to feel it both when they go into the supermarket and they see kind of, well, what's here, constrained stuff to buy, but also in terms of the prices that people have to pay. The politics of this are going to be really sharp. I think the anti-war movement in this country has often asked itself after Vietnam, why haven't we had the kind of successful mass anti-war mobilizations in the global north that we had previously, either at the revolutions that defeated the First World War or the movement against the Vietnam War, particularly in the US, and that brought the war to an end in tandem with the resistance of the Vietnamese, of course. And partly it's conscription, right? Is that you haven't had mass conscription into the army, for example, in 2003 or 2001, when you had the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan. So you can have these big mobilizations against the war, but the question doesn't penetrate itself into working class life in the same way that it might have done in the First World War or in the 60s and 70s. But when you have that question of the way in which the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the way that the conflict is going to massively affect supply chains across the world, massively then increases the cost that people have to pay for basic goods, whether that's pharmaceuticals or food or fuel, whatever it is, like that is going to pay political dividends in the end. And we have to consider that when we think about I think we have to consider that when we think about how we resist imperialism, which, this country can be quite good at, mass anti-imperialism, but how we make that struggle felt to people. Those two things have to be twinned together a lot more carefully, I think. I really agree about Zach Polanski. I want to defend him and Zara a little bit, actually, because I really agree with you, but I think the moment is quite difficult, which is that, what alternatives globally are there to NATO in an era of relatively few left governments, diminishingly few third world, seemingly anti-imperialist states that could forge an alliance in the sort of spirit of the non-aligned movement in the 60s and 70s. When you don't have that, it's quite difficult to talk about an alternative, like a concrete alternative, in the way that the left did in the 60s and 70s did. And I think that's important. But I think you're right. I was really encouraged by Zach's comments when the US was talking about invading Greenland, and it had mass support. 55% of the population supported his comments when polled. It's worth bearing that in mind. And when you get examples like that, the question for the left is how you prize that open further. I'm pretty keen to just be like, we should just say as a matter of course that we want all US bases off British soil, to be honest with you, as a kind of principle. A couple of other things for me, obviously the big context to this is the rise of China as a growing imperialist power. China's rise was centrally bound up with the demise of industry in the West and the kind of explosion of Chinese manufacturing capacity of cheap consumable durable goods in the 90s and the noughties in particular, right? That's less so the case now, right? The China's industrial turn has gone from that to more like high-tech manufacturing and renewables. And they're outdoing the US on that front as well. When we talk about living through history, when I talk about living through history, a new city the size of New York and Boston has been built once a year, every year in China for the past 35 years. That's incredibly, it's off the charts, right? And people talk about an economic growth miracle. Obviously that has happened on the backs of Chinese and migrant workers in China, and we should never obfuscate that fact. There's this line from Carl Liebknecht, the kind of German socialist from the First World War, that the left is often fond of quoting, and I think it's important. The main enemy is at home. You know, it's the big thing that the left talks about, that he kind of screened from Parliament during the First World War. And Neil Davidson, who's passed away now, but is a Marxist that influenced a lot of my thinking, always said we have to complicate that statement a bit. The main enemy is at home, but not the only enemy.
Yeah.
Right? Which isn't to say, for example, that we should deny the fact that, you know, you cannot grasp the war on Ukraine without having a sense of NATO's encirclement of Russia for 20 years after the collapse of the USSR, right? You just cannot grasp that happening without that fact. But at the same time, our anti-imperialist politics here have to be keen to the fact that our main enemy is at home, but we shouldn't necessarily be soft on imperialist powers and abroad, or refrain from criticizing them when they're devastating other countries and their own people, which I think is increasingly more important now when you live in a multipolar world. That said, the focus for us now really has to be on cultivating as much support for this, you know, disconnecting Britain from the war in Iran that's ongoing now. And for me, I have, you know, big questions about that in terms of what it says about the weakness of US imperialism, because I there's a big part of me that, you know, the analysis of the left for lots of years and it rightly, I think, was Israel is the lapdog of US imperialism. You know, Israel articulates and defends US imperial interests in the Middle East. And I think that was valid for decades. But as US imperialism weakens, I think, and Israel has the kind of psychosis of a settler colonial project with all of the violence that comes with that, and also the immediacy of Netanyahu trying to defend his reign in power and make sure that he can stay in power for as long as possible. I do think we have to countenance the possibility that sometimes, and this isn't to buy into any of the anti-Semitic veneers that kind of contextualize the arguments around the Israeli lobby, but it's to say in US imperialism's weakness, sometimes Israel is shaping US imperialism's direction more than it might have 10 or 20 years ago. And I think we have to take that quite seriously. You know, after the genocide in Lebanon and elsewhere, Israel created facts on the grounds that strengthened the US's position, whereas it had otherwise been weakened after Iraq and Afghanistan. And now you're seeing an incredible exercise in hubris in their war on Iran. And I think we have to think about how that relationship affects our politics here.
Yeah, and the most obvious way that's the most obvious way that is expressed in the war in Iran is the contradictory thing of, you know, attacking Iran's oil supply and the oil supply to the rest of the world, and yet desanctioning Iranian oil at the same time, because the US has realized that actually we're incredibly dependent on this and we can't push up oil prices too high. It's like a very postmodern war, you know what I mean? I mean, just to emphasize this point on multipolarity and kind of like geopolitical realignment. This is obviously not something that just the left's saying. I mean, there's the Mark Carney speech to, I can't remember whether it's the UN or the EU recently, where he talked about the rules-based order basically being ripped up and us charting new territory. But there's this quote from a New Statesman piece on Ed Miliband, and yeah, I do now read the New Statesman because actually under Tom McTaggart's gotten like surprisingly good. But there's this quote from a long-term. No, genuinely revisit the New Statesman. They sacked off Cowley or whoever the last editor was, and now they've got Tom McTaggart. And actually, they're producing some really good writing. It's very, very surprising to me.
I just find it funny that you had to say that, because I read the New Statesman as well. But
yeah, it's embarrassing, mate. It's embarrassing. I don't buy it. I just use the little paywall, you know, like the little paywall skipper, and then you put in the
archive.ph, man. Big up.
Yeah. Don't worry, I don't pay my money. Anyway, there's this quote from a long-term Miliband ally that said that America is aligning itself with the petrostates, undermining support for the climate agenda, and actively trying to destroy jobs in the renewable sectors. This is extraordinary, an ideological campaign. Miliband, they argued, will end up aligning Britain with the electrostates in Europe and China. The clash between Labour and Reform in 2019 was not about values or any policy area other than this, in their view. Farage is a fifth column for a US-backed petrostate campaign in Britain. Like, what a fascinating kind of like realignment of how essentially like social democrats are viewing politics right now, right? It's just, it really is incredibly important and fair for Shanice to essentially articulate this as new times, with like new possibilities and like this sense of like mass realignment. I think it really is there, and I do think that we're in a moment where we absolutely have to try and instigate some kind of mass anti-war movement. Like we may not have conscription, so it may not penetrate into working class communities in the way that it did back in the 60s and 70s. And you're right, Jonas, or maybe you're right. Maybe shocks to food prices and other basic goods because of war will be the instigator of that. But it just is the case that we're living in this moment that Naomi Klein, I think, is now calling end times fascism, where we have we have this kind of like death cult. Richard Seymour talks about this too. This kind of like death cult right wing project that has an ideological core that fantasizes about the apocalypse, but we also have the technological ability to follow through with that, with mass nuclear proliferation since the mid 19th century, and also just increased technological power in terms of surveilling of people and the understanding of what people are doing through mass communications and the internet. It's never been the case that such ideologically extreme people already do and will hold such power to just both control populations but also end them. And I think in that context, the only response that can come from the left is just like a mass anti-war movement and a mass movement for peace and a mass movement for denuclearization. My only caveat to that is that there's just I just have a worry that we put all of this on Zach's head or on Zach's shoulders. And I think what I mean by that is like I have I was trying to come up with a good phrase for this and I can't find one, but I have this kind of like sense of Zach and the Green Project at the moment being quite fragile and precious, insofar as they're obviously being incredibly successful and they're surging in the polls and they're breaking new ground for what a Green Party will do. Like I can't tell you how different the UK Green Party is to the Australian Green Party that I've been talking to a bunch of people about over the last couple of weeks. Yet there's something to be protected there, right? Because they may well be our opportunity to have an electoral breakthrough, and the electoral opportunity that's presenting itself in the UK at the moment to the Green Left is pretty huge, and it makes me feel quite small c conservative when thinking about the project. In that, part of me is like, yes, I want Zach to break all of this ground and lead this kind of like new anti-war movement and seize this opportunity in these times of radical change. And I think his argument around American bases was a really good step towards that. It drew on a deep anti-Americanism that I think is just kind of there in British culture, and it was popular and smart. There's also another part of me that thinks, fuck, I actually want these issues, at least for Zach, to be really, really low salience, because although anti-war is deeply popular, people also want a sense of safety, and they don't want to think that a Green government is going to get in and basically make them and their families less safe in some way. And you look at how people relate to, not specifically NATO, but security and stuff, and it's not an issue that tends to matter to the voters we're trying to win over, but it is an issue that matters to voters that we're not going to win over, and whacking up the salience of that, at least for an electoral project, is not necessarily going to benefit them when compared to talking about, the quote unquote Zoran issues, fast and free buses, freezing the rent, etc., etc. So that, I think that's just where my cautiousness comes from, and that, like, I completely agree with you guys that like we live in unprecedented times, and there is a huge opportunity for realignment, and the left can really push in that direction and make a lot of headway. But I worry about putting it on the shoulders of Zach and on the shoulders of the Green Party just because of the electoral opportunity that sits ahead of them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I actually don't think it should be put on Zach and the Green Party. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, this is like the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th time I've said this on this podcast, but Zach's fresh, man. Like, I just, to be able to step into the political arena and hold the traditions of internationalism and the traditions of the anti-war movement on your shoulders in this big historical moment. I'm not even sure he's the right person to do that. I think, you know, him and his team should work on developing, you know, really solid arguments and moving the Green Party in a consistent and kind of radical direction on this question. But the second bit of it is the bit around working class militancy. And that actually, like, I think the politics of this question, for me, emerges out of the centrality of the working class and the idea of working class militancy as a form of resistance against imperialism and militarism. So this is where maybe, Jonas, I don't disagree with what you said, but I just want to say yes and. So you talked about, you know, there aren't these left-wing governments to kind of build the idea of an alternative to kind of NATO and an alternative alliance. But the sentiment is there in kind of the working class, right? Like all across the West, in the US, in Britain, this war in Iran is unpopular. So the sentiment is there. And, you know, just look at Farage. He made an error of first pivoting to kind of defend the war and demanding that Keir Starmer open up, you know, British military bases and send missiles, and then realized, oh shit, my base doesn't like this and I'm going to have to pivot back to, well, you know, war is not so great. So working class people do resist out of moral indignation, not just kind of when things hit us materially, and not just when, you know, things work against our immediate material interests. So, you know, Jonas, the alternative to looking to kind of left-wing governments around the world for alliances is looking to just mass working class militancy and having kind of that at the core of your idea of what an alternative to militarism and imperialism looks like. And we've got examples that we can take inspiration from, you know, the Greek dockers, for example, who shut shit down across the Mediterranean to stop arm imports into Europe. The Italian grassroots unions who called a 24-hour general strike in solidarity with Gaza. So, you know, there are pockets where we can look to working class militancy as, I guess, the kind of the core of how we understand what resistance and what we understand socialist alternatives to imperialism to look like. So to go back to the Green Party and Zach Polanski, you know, the Green Party don't have deep roots in traditional working class institutions, and as diminished as they are compared to the 20th century, you know, the trade unions still represent millions of workers and still represent a lever of working class power that the Greens are fairly disconnected from. Daniel Kabide of the NEU has been making some noises about, you know, the Green Party being more aligned to the NEU's politics and teachers' politics than the Labour Party. But these links are still fresh. These links are still new. And so absent of Zach Polanski and absent of the Green Party being really rooted in these levers of working class power, I think it often forces him to look to existing institutions like the EU as an alternative to NATO. But I think in comparison, there are a whole host of reasons why that is a weak and certainly not an anti-war position.
I mean, look, for sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I guess for me, the point was more, that's okay if you're us free, but if you're like a Zara Sultana or someone, like that might not be how they think about politics, you know, and how left politicians necessarily think about politics. I might be wrong about that, and I say that not because I desire that world where you have all of these anti-imperialist states, and that, you know, I think that could be questioned in lots of ways anyway, right? That form a kind of global alliance against the first world, whilst also keeping their independence from the kind of formal communist world, right? I don't necessarily think that's my horizon. It's not at all, really. Like, I think the anti-imperialism of today has to be more substantive than that. But there's this other question, right? Which is what does not falling into the liberal trap look like? You know, how do we differentiate ourselves from isolationism without collapsing into an embrace of the European Union, for example? You know, I have that kind of question, like, and that's why I asked the question: what do these global anti-imperialist alliances look like? You know, because in World War I, you had the Communist International, and like that was like central for coordinating some of that sort of stuff, or at least it's let me. The lefty nerds are going to get me that its precursors were central to coordinating, you know, mass global resistance in the revolutionary struggle. But maybe it looks something like in the noughties when you had the ultra globalization movements, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe it looks like something like that. I guess that's what I'm trying to pin down. And look, I really do agree. You don't want to rely. I really, really agree that you don't want to rely on Zach too much. One, because he exists in an institutional environment with all of this pressure on him, and two, because you don't want to put your eggs in one basket, right? Like if the fragility of your anti-imperialist politics is on one person at the leadership of this political party, then it's sketchy, right, to say the least. And so for me, that begs the question of, in the news section, I've kind of trying to trouble the left ecology thing. And this one, I'm going to bring it back and say, no, this is where it's really important. It's important to have that ecology, right? Where it's like, okay, Sharon Graham denounces Rachel Reeves for not introducing investments in the arms industry quick enough, all right? You need to have trade unionists on the left who are opposing her on that in this time of remilitarization across Britain and Europe, right? This question of rising fuel prices, for example, can you re-articulate that away from what might be its inevitable home on the right and in the reform camp into a different story around food prices, around the prices of basic goods? You know what I mean? Can you bring that story in? So like it's crucial to have that ecology, and in that ecology to be building up new political leaders, right? The Palestine question broke a logjam in politics and produced a legion of new political leaders, right? We can all lament over how that's gone in some particular instances over the last year, but that was a reality. What new forms of struggle produce new leaders, and how do we reduce the dependency on, say, just the Green Party and just Zach, and create new forms of leadership and new stories based on new kind of organizing ecologies?
Just one example of how, we often reference Zach Polanski and Zoran Mamdani, and something struck me about Zoran Mamdani recently in terms of this idea of freshness and how we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket and shouldn't kind of look to these leaders as heroes that save the left, and if only we can just replicate more Zoran Mamdanis, which is when he was asked about the Irish question. And he was asked, he was asked what he thinks about a united Ireland, and he was like, "Oh, I don't really know much about that." And then next interview, he had his line ready to go, and it just makes you realize actually how so much of what Zoran Mamdani does and so much of what Zach Polanski does isn't movement memory.
Yeah,
it's talking points. That's a context where actually that question of political leadership feels a little bit more fragile.
For sure.
Okay, now on to the readings. This is where we round out the show with something that we've either been reading or listening to over the last 2 weeks. Jonas, what have you got?
Yeah, for me this week it's Mélenchon's book. I think it translated and released here in 2022. I've not got it in front of me, but I think it's called We the People by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Genuine example of a leader of a radical left party in Europe trying to think meaningfully about what radical politics should be, feel like, and do in practice today. I mean, I have disagreements with the book. It doesn't take the question of demographic aging seriously, but it's truly thinking on the terms of that counter civilizational politics, and it's trying to conjure up a way of thinking about how politics connects with that features of everyday life that I just, how you connect that to a totalizing vision of how you transform the world. And in part I really love it because it's such a clear break from that kind of French left Republican parochialism, and engages kind of systematically with radical thinkers like people like David Harvey, for example, and tries to reinvent some of that. And I'm not always convinced that it achieves that reinvention, but I appreciate the effort.
Cool, thanks. And Shanice?
Yeah, so mine isn't a reading this week, it's a podcast, and a lot of our listeners probably listen to Politics Theory Other, which is a really, really great podcast, quite different to ours in that it's kind of much more intellectual. Not to say our podcast isn't intellectual, but they have on academics, trained academics who have written big books about, really important topics. Hang on, I've written a book.
Trained
Well, you both
academics
written a book.
writing big books.
I mean, I think that, well, no, but I think, but maybe this is the caveat that we've always wanted to get out about this podcast, is that none of us are academics.
Yeah.
As much as that may be hard to believe. None of us are academics.
So this is a slight segue, but both Jonas and I have written books, but we are not academics. I studied to bachelor's, And yeah, everyone's always like, so where do you work? What uni? And it's like, no, I have a normal 9 to 5.
Yeah, man, I got a Desmond, so no academic
Oh, bruh.
Wait,
Probably
there's no way I'm the most. Wait, there's no way I'm the most highly educated person on this podcast. That's wild.
Have you got a master's?
No, I dropped out halfway through.
Yeah,
but I did half a master's.
There you are. Yeah, you are. You are.
Wow. Okay.
Anyway, so in other news, I will stop digging out myself and my fellow podcast hosts. But no, Politics Theory, other great podcast. There have been 2 episodes that I've listened to about 2 or 3 times each. There's the one with Richard Seymour called The Donroe Doctrine and US Decline. And then there's one called Homeland Empire with Nikhil Pal Singh. 2 really fantastic episodes that have really helped me understand and contextualize this idea of US decline and how the notion of US decline frames the Trump administration and what the hell is going on in the world. So yeah, I would check out the podcast in general, but those 2 episodes specifically.
Cool, thanks. And I very predictably am still reading the book that I recommended 2 weeks ago, so I do not have a new book for you. I will not recommend the Ed Miliband interview from the New Statesman, because I feel like I'll get exiled from this podcast if I do that. So instead I'm going to go for something quite different. And I don't actually know how I felt about this podcast, but it was an episode of Where We Should Begin with Esther Perel. If you've never come across Where We Should Begin with Esther Perel, it'll probably save your relationship, so you should start listening to it. It's basically like a therapy advice podcast with this woman called Esther Perel, who's this famous therapist. It is interspersed with really annoying mattress adverts where she'll deliver this really like heartfelt, wonderful therapy session with someone and then try and sell you a fucking Casper mattress for 200 quid or whatever with the same voice, and it's deeply annoying. But ignoring the adverts, she did an episode a couple of weeks ago called Love, Loneliness and AI. Where should we begin? It's basically an interview with a guy who's fallen in love with his AI, which I know sounds silly and like a crap episode of Black Mirror, but I thought it was a kind of like freakish and maybe prescient window into, I just think, a more individualized political culture where instead of people risking romantic and relational attachment with other human beings, with all of the like mystery and difficulty that involves, instead, we're getting caught up in essentially these algorithmic reflections of ourselves. And up until this point, the forefront of that has been social media and your social media algorithm. But, no one was ever falling in love with their social media algorithm. But now people are falling in love with their AI bots that are basically like trained to please you in this like very scary way. And I just think there are so many ramifications for like collectivity, solidarity, and left politics in that. As individuals getting stuck in these kind of like this world of mirrors. Anyway, so listen to it, see what you think. I hope you're as freaked out by the kind of like sexy baby voice that the guy gave his AI that I was, because it was fucking weird. Anyway, to end on an unexpected note, I promise I'll read something for next week. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Shanice. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant episode. If you thought that was a brilliant episode too, and by you I mean the listener, yes, you can support us at lifeoftheparty.uk/support. If you do so, and if you support us at a significant enough level, you'll get loads of benefits, including getting your name read out at the end of each podcast. So with all of that, we have to say thank you to Michael. Michael, our higher tier subscriber. I actually think there's other higher tier subscribers that we're not mentioning yet, so I do need to go and look at who else is subscribing. But anyway, thank you, Michael, and thank you others. We'll see you soon.
Safe.
Peace.
This is an Ampersounds production.